my beautiful buds. Welcome back to my channel, Sprouts with Joy. My name is Joy, and if you like to talk about plants, you're in the right place. Today, I wanted to share with you guys all of the plants in my collection that are part of the Marantaceae family. The Marantaceae family is also commonly known as prayer plants, and I think it's comprised of somewhere in the ballpark of over 30 genera. However, the kinds that we most commonly find in garden centers and make their way into our homes as houseplants are calatheas, goeppertias, stromanthes, ctenanthes, and marantas. And if there are any others, I mean, let me know, but I'm pretty sure those are the main ones. I've never actually had all of them in the same room, so it's kind of fun to see them all together. They're quite beautiful plants. They're very striking, and their foliage and the leaves, typically with all of these guys, will fold up and down, hence why they're called prayer plants. The leaves tend to move over the course of the day. Another thing to note is that I believe, to my understanding, the vast majority of plants that were in the calathea genus have been reclassified into goeppertia. They're still colloquially known as calatheas and labeled as calatheas in garden centers. So for calathea and goeppertia, I somewhat see them as interchangeable, even though they're technically not. But yeah, I'm just gonna start. I'm gonna go by genus and kind of share the stories and general care tips that I have for each of these plants. First, I have to start with this one because I believe that this was my first Marantaceae plant that I got, period. This is a Goeppertia ornata, but I purchased it as a pinstripe calathea or calathea ornata. Like, those are also very common names for this plant. And right now, for some reason, it's misbehaving and all the leaves are in the up position rather than fanned outward like they normally would be. I suspect that's because it's used to being underneath a really intense grow light.
And it's also very dusty, so don't mind me dusting this plant casually.
But as you can see, I mean, the leaves of this plant are really, really beautiful. The lines on them look like they were painted on, and the backs of the leaves too are this very beautiful plum color. And there's a new leaf on the way, which is really fun, but it's not only a new leaf, it's also like an entirely new stem that's growing from, I think they're called rhizomes underneath the soil. It's actually in this little basket that I thrifted, but the true pot that it's in is this clear pot. So you can see the root system in there. They're pretty gnarly looking. But yeah, this is a very lively plant. I will say, because this was my first ever plant in the Marantaceae family, there was a bit of a learning curve, and this plant very much almost died multiple times, and we're still kind of struggling a little bit. I mean, you can see there are some crispy edges to the plant as well as some beautiful leaves. I mean, but this plant has gone down to only 2 or 3 leaves in the past. Me and this plant, we really just kind of go in waves. I feel like there's an ebb and flow where there will be a season where this plant is really, really happy and putting out lots and lots of growth, and there will be a season where this plant, you know, say I miss a watering or something, it throws a tantrum and gets super dramatic and gets really crispy edges. So I think the number one mistakes that I made with this plant when I first got it were, first of all, I did not give it nearly enough light. When I purchased it from the garden center, it said, "Oh, well, this is a low light plant," which I kind of disagree with. I've kind of found that my Goeppertia in particular really thrive and do well in more light. Marantas, you can get away with lower light.
But with Goeppertia or calathea, this kind specifically, they do better with higher light.
Like medium to bright indirect light is great. I have this one underneath a grow light right now, but when I first got it, I had it like 10 feet away from a north facing window, and that just did not cut it. I'm pretty sure I had it close to a heating vent too, which was another big no-no. The air around this plant was so dry. And also, as a side note, I barely supplement humidity for any of these plants anymore, but for the winter time, I do generally run a humidifier, but like I don't have any of these plants in my greenhouse cabinet.
And I found that they do pretty well around 50% humidity. You don't need to go crazy more than that with most of these plants.
But anyway, this plant started being crisped into oblivion. It was awful. And I think that was because I was watering it really inconsistently. And I did experiment with using distilled water instead of my tap water, which
I watered all of my Marantaceae family plants like with distilled water for like a whole year.
But the problem with that is that it actually discouraged me from watering them as often as they needed to be because it was such a bother to water them. I eventually switched over to tap water, and I actually have not noticed any difference at all between using distilled and tap water. Although, I mean, if you live in an area where your water is very hard, very heavy in minerals, sure, I mean, you can try out using distilled water and that's totally fine. And maybe they would be happier, but I just have not noticed a big enough difference to make it worth it to me to go through the hassle of using distilled water.
No, none of my plants are gonna get that special treatment anymore.
But yeah, I was trying to use distilled water. I didn't feel like it was making that big of a difference. I tried to use a humidifier, didn't feel like it was making that big of a difference. It just kept on declining. But then eventually, for some reason, like I had this plant for like an entire year. I finally got it into a higher light situation, but it looked pitiful. Eventually, it just started being happy. And the only way that I can explain it is that I think that the trick with the Marantaceae family, if you're able to, is to tough it out for like that first year or so. It's gonna look like crap after you bring it home.
You know, it looks perfect in the greenhouse because it's in ideal conditions and it was grown there. But then when you bring it home, it's going to go through a period where it's going to throw tantrums. It's going to be mad because you switched it from perfect conditions to subpar conditions, relatively speaking.
And, you know, there are things that you can do to try to ease that transition. But generally speaking, with most of these plants, when you bring them home, they're going to decline, they're not going to look as pretty, and they're going to get crispy edges, and some of the leaves are going to die off. But once you can start getting this plant to grow new leaves in your home, it's usually a bit more of an upward trend from there, because in my experience, once this plant started growing, the new leaves would get the crispy edges less and less often. Now, they still do. Like, if I miss a watering or I let it go a little bit too long and the leaves just start drooping and I'm like, oh crap, I missed my window of opportunity to water this plant, it's going to start getting crispy edges again. I mean, look, the older leaves just all have that. But the new leaves, when they come in for quite a while, they're flawless and beautiful. I mean, look at how massive this leaf is. And no crispy edges really to be seen. Like, it's a beautiful, beautiful leaf. So really, that's been my experience, is you just have to water them really consistently. I'm rambling a lot at this point about the care, and I've only spoken about one plant. But yeah, this is the one that has taught me a lot of lessons, and it's still working on recovering to even the point where it was at when I first got this plant. Like, it's still not there yet, and I've had it for almost 3 years now. But it has been a 3 years rife with losing leaves, gaining leaves, figuring this plant out. And now I think that we're generally in a stable position. My next goeppertia is the Goeppertia zebrina, and this plant has also had a lot of ups and downs, particularly because it has battled spider mites a number of times. And that is one thing that you're definitely gonna have to look out for when it comes to plants in the Marantaceae collection, is that they are fairly prone to spider mites. I mean, a lot of plants are, including like philodendron and alocasia and stuff like that. But these guys, I mean, you wanna be wary, you wanna be on the lookout for spider mites. And if you don't know what spider mites are, honestly, just be checking the undersides of your leaves all the time. And if it looks like there's dust on it, like white dust that is suspiciously in lines along the creases of the plant or along like the edges next to where the stem is on the leaf, if that makes sense, those are probably spider mites. And if you see webbing, that means that the infestation is fairly significant. But I think that of all the plants in my Marantaceae collection, this is actually one of my absolute favorites in terms of the way that the leaves look. Like, it is beautiful, and the leaves are so soft and just, they're so nice.
Although yes, I have had a bit of a struggle with this plant here and there because it's gotten spider mites a few times, and so I've had to like cut back a lot of the old growth that was infested and then ugly, and you know, I've had to treat it over and over again. And this plant has also gone through seasons where it was just really unhappy.
I think I featured this plant on like my struggling plants list like a year ago at this point. But now it's going fairly strong, and it has been all summer, so we'll see how the winter time treats it, because I have found that, you know, when the winter strikes, sometimes that sets back a lot of these plants because of the lack of light and the lack of humidity. They're just like a little bit less happy, and so you have to maybe be mindful to pamper them a little bit more to get them through the winter season. My next goeppertia is the Goeppertia makoyana, which is honestly one of my favorites because look at how full and gorgeous she is. And it's also commonly known as the peacock calathea. As you can see, I mean, the leaves look literally just like a peacock, which is pretty incredible. This one, I don't think it's ever actually gotten spider mites. It did have a period of time where it had some mild root rot, and so a lot of the leaves were drooping and just curling up and really not looking great. It lost so many leaves during that period of time. I don't even fully understand how I got it to recover. It just kind of did, because yeah, it had root rot. And so I just like took it out of the pot. I kind of just removed some of the bad roots, and I replenished the soil, refreshed the soil, put it back, and I was very gentle through the whole process. And then I just was watering it consistently, and it just kind of bounced back and started growing like crazy, especially during the spring and summertime of this year. Yeah, I'm really, really grateful for that because I absolutely love this plant. It is so lush. I really love how this plant has grown. And like, dude, look at this leaf. It's like the size of my face. It's crazy. Honestly, of all of the goeppertia specifically, I know I've had some hiccups with it here and there, but like of all of the goeppertia that I have, like this one has had like the least amount of crispy edges. So if you're gonna go for a goeppertia specifically, in my experience, this one has been the easiest one to take care of. This right here is, I think it's called the goeppertia insignis, although I purchased it as a calathea lancifolia, but it's also commonly known as a rattlesnake calathea. This one definitely looks a bit more humble. I love this plant, and I really admired it from afar for a long time. And then I finally got my own, and it just kind of disappointed just a little bit. It's about the same size as when I got it almost 2 years ago at this point. Like, it's gotten new leaves, but as old leaves die off, new leaves come in and just kind of replace the old leaves, so it hasn't gotten much bigger. I know these guys are capable of getting massively long leaves and just getting so full and beautiful, but this one just hasn't done it for me. And it also doesn't help that, okay, my cats really usually don't chew on my plants. Sometimes they knock them over or kind of like claw at them, but they usually don't chew them. However, this is one plant specifically that my cats have taken to nibbling on. So as you can see, there's just a few leaves that have gotten bite marks. And thankfully, the Marantaceae family in general, like all these plants that I'm talking about, I'm pretty positive are non-toxic to pets, which is a huge plus, a huge win for the Marantaceae family. But somehow my cats can like sense that, so they've taken to taking bites out of the leaves, specifically when they're newly emerging leaves, you know, when they're like the little taquito roll-up things that are coming out. My cats will just, you know, they just kind of take a bite out of it, which definitely ruins the aesthetic of the plant to a degree. And obviously it's not all of the leaves, but it's enough of them that sometimes when I look at it, I'm just like, ugh. But yeah, this is one in particular that it's been stable, but it's never totally thrived in my care. So that's definitely a big goal of mine, to eventually get this one to thrive. I mean, it has some new growth coming up. I don't know if you can see that right there. There's just like a tiny little new growth. There's new growth right here.
But every time there's new growth, I do feel like I tend to lose some leaves. Like this one's kind of on its way out. So it's like, are you ever really gonna thrive for me? I don't know.
Maybe it just wants more humidity than what I've been giving it, because it's just an ambient humidity right now. Maybe I'll experiment with putting this in my greenhouse cabinet and see if that cracks the code with it. I believe that that was all of the goeppertia in my collection. And now this right here, I thought was my only true calathea. I think the actual name is like the calathea lietzei, I think. This is specifically like the calathea yellow fusion, but you might be more aware of its counterpart, the calathea white fusion, which is like a different cultivar. I didn't realize that my cat was in here, but she just crawled out from under the bed.
Anyway, you are probably more aware of its like popular other cultivar of the same species, the calathea white fusion.
It is notorious for being like probably the most challenging calathea out there. I can probably attest to that. I mean, I've had this one for about 1.5 years now, and right now, I mean, it's obviously looking really, really beautiful in a lot of ways. Like, the leaves aren't perfect, but like it's full and it's not like too crazily crispy or anything like that. And I did recently repot it, and I need to get like a nice cover pot for this because this is like not doing this justice. This is sort of an interesting case because when I looked it up, it looks like this has been reclassified to maranta, which is really weird because it does not look like a maranta like at all, in my opinion, at least not like the other maranta that I have. But I mean, sure. But here, I'm gonna let you take a closer look at it. They're really, really beautiful. Obviously, I do think that the white fusion is a little bit prettier because, you know, I'm not super into the yellow variegation that much, but like, it's still quite pretty, and I love how the leaves are kind of wavy and they look painted on. Like, it's just really, really beautiful. Whoops, my camera stopped recording and I don't really fully know where I left off. I will say this plant, of like all of my plants, is definitely a spider mite magnet. I feel like it gets spider mites at least 2 or 3 times a year, and at this point we just kind of have a rhythm where, I mean, the first time that happened, it was completely infested. When I discovered it, excuse me, cat? What are you doing? So the first time that this plant got spider mites, it was like completely infested by the time I noticed it. And so I had to like, I almost threw the plant out because I was just like, what? But I was kind of stubborn because I really wanted to prove to myself that I could handle a calathea yellow fusion, because yeah, these guys are notorious for being difficult, at least the white fusion. But again, I wanted to prove it to myself that I could handle it. So I treated it, and then I did end up sticking it outside last summer, and it was outside all summer, covered, you know, kind of in a very shaded location, and it thrived, absolutely thrived, exploded with growth. And you know, some of the leaves would get like a little bit scorched or a little bit iffy just from being outside, but I would just trim them away, prune it. I prune this plant honestly quite often. Over the winter time, it just kind of was like meh inside my house, but as soon as I could, I stuck it outside again this summer, and so it's been living outside. When it gets spider mites, I just treat it with a spray bottle filled with water, dish soap, and rubbing alcohol. I spray down every leaf, especially concentrating on the back sides of the leaves because that's where spider mites really like to congregate. And I just like rub it with my fingers, and I do that, you know, several days in a row. That usually takes care of the problem for the most part. But yeah, when it's outside especially, it also tends to get spider mites because it's outside and exposed to pests. But I just try to treat it really thoroughly, especially before I bring it back inside. And then, so yeah, I think that that's gonna be my rhythm for this plant. That's all, that's my only secret, is I put it outside in the shade over the summer, and it really loves the humidity, really loves the light. And when it's outside, I water it like multiple times a week, and it really likes it. Yeah, honestly, that's my only care advice for this plant, is put it outside over the summer, and the rest of the time you just, it exists. Okay, and since that one was technically kind of a maranta, I guess I'll dive into the marantas. And this was the first maranta that I ever got. It's a red veined maranta, or Maranta leuconeura. Erythroneura, I think, is the variety. And yeah, this plant is really, really pretty. It's gone through some different iterations. I have chopped and propped this plant a few times, you know, added the propagations back into the pot, because these plants do tend to get a little bit on the leggy side. You know, you let them grow out, and then if you miss some waterings, the older leaves will die off, and then you'll have like a really long stem with like some leaves at the end, but like a lot of empty nodes. So I found that it's helpful to propagate this plant and kind of like put it back into the pot sometimes. This plant also early on in my journey got spider mites a handful of times. This was actually like my first time ever dealing with spider mites. Like, this was the first plant that I had that had spider mites, and I was like,
oh my gosh, what do I do?
But yeah, it has since survived that very, very well. The other thing is that I actually used to have this in terracotta, and it was okay. But honestly, for any plant that's in the Marantaceae family, I would strongly advise against putting it in terracotta. I think I do have one in terracotta right now, and it's been okay. But generally speaking, I feel like these plants tend to prefer more moisture than not. Terracotta is just so porous and it dries out really quickly. So unless you're like really on top of watering for these plants, I mean, they don't want to be like soggy all the time necessarily. I don't know. I found personally more success with keeping them in a plastic or ceramic pot, but that's just me. But anyway, I digress. This plant also, I have an extremely low light circumstance.
This I recommended, you know, if you need to put a plant in a low light corner. I actually have a video on it where I talked about the plants that I have that are like in the lowest light in my collection, and this was one of the ones that I've kept in the lowest amount of light.
In those circumstances, it actually surprisingly like still grows pretty well. I mean, look how full and gorgeous it is. But I will say, when you have it growing in low light, the leaves are gonna come out just like, no, that's not a good example. Where is it? They're gonna like not be quite as bold in color. You know, they might be a little bit washed out. Whereas when I had this plant in an east facing window, it was throwing out leaves more like this. So I guess it just kind of depends on the look that you want. I found if you have it in brighter light, it's gonna get like these bold leaves that are really striking and beautiful. But if you don't mind like kind of this type of look, you know, where it's just not, it's still beautiful, but it's not this degree of striking and dark.
Yeah, you can grow it in lower light and you'll get leaves more like this. So in my experience, that's kind of how that works.
But yeah, honestly, I found this plant to be incredibly easy. As long as you're on the lookout for spider mites and you water it consistently. I mean, it consistently is growing for me all the time. That's all I can say. Hi, Ginny, what's up? In front of the camera, do you? This is Ginny. Typically, Alphonse is the cat that's on camera because he's a little bit friendlier. But Ginny is a cute kitty. Oh, you're not happy. But Ginny is my cute black cat and she has extra toes. Do you see her extra toes? Good thing I'm wearing a black shirt. This is another Maranta leuconeura of mine, but it's like the lemon lime version. So it's kind of the counterpart to this one, but it has more of like the lime green to it, which I also really like this plant. I have propagated this a number of times. I actually really recently pruned it and propagated it and kind of like repotted it into a different pot because like I was saying about this plant, it was just getting really, really leggy. I mean, you can kind of see right here is almost an example of that, not quite as extreme, but you know, it like will sometimes lose some of these leaves and you get some bare stems and it's just not quite as pretty as it could be. Pretty much everything that I said about this plant can apply to this plant. Honestly, once I kind of like got in the rhythm of taking care of this plant, as long as I'm watering it consistently and I'm not letting it dry out to the point where it's like drooping all the time. I mean, sometimes I make that mistake and this is what I show for it. You know, I get these crispy tips when I am not consistent enough with watering it. But for the most part, as long as I'm good with the plant, it's good with me, I guess. And it's growing a lot. I mean, I've got new growth everywhere. This is one that I actually do have in somewhat higher light, at least compared to this one. And as you can see, most of its leaves are fairly bold. I'd say that this is probably in more like medium light. It's not low light, but it's also not like super bright light.
This is another gorgeous one. You just kind of like pick which flavor you want between the two of them because in my experience, they're pretty much the same, except for the color.
This right here is my Maranta silver band, which I believe that this is actually also technically a Maranta leuconeura. As you can see, it's very, very silvery. And the leaves are a little bit more round, I think, than the other Marantas that I have in my collection. But this one, since I've had it, has like been blooming for me nonstop. And I tend to trim off all of the blooms. I think I'll leave them for a little bit, but eventually I'm like, okay,
let's calm down with your little blooms.
I don't really have any active blooms, I don't think, but here it's like trying to bloom. It has like a little bud showing up, but I would rather the plant put energy into the leaves than the blooms personally. I mean, I think that they're cute and all, but I do prefer the leaves over the blooms. I haven't really had this plant for a super long time, but honestly, I feel like the care has been virtually the same again as my other Marantas. But obviously the look is a little bit different. It's more silvery. I've definitely considered getting like a Maranta black, I think it is, but I'm kind of waiting for the price to go down on them a little bit more because this plant used to be pretty expensive, but nowadays it's actually very affordable. I got this at my local garden center for like $16 or $17. And when I originally had this plant on my wish list, I think it was upwards of $50. Somewhere in that ballpark.
I'm very glad that the price has come down on them, that they're more accessible, and I hope that you guys are able to find one too, because it's just gorgeous. And like the backs of the leaves, of course, that's another characteristic that I really love.
Yeah, it's just like a very sweet little basket here. Next, I'm going to talk about the Maranta kerchoveana. And this one looks a little bit sad. I actually have it propagating in water because my original plant was just getting really leggy and iffy, so I chopped it up and I put it in water, but it's been several months, and so now the leaves that were once flawless are looking a little bit worse for wear. So, I mean, I guess keep that in mind if you're gonna be keeping this plant in water for a while. I'm not entirely certain why it's reacting this way. It could be that the water is not distilled water, so being exposed to the tap water for such a long time is causing these issues. It could also be that I haven't fertilized the water at all, so... Sorry, I had to let my cat out. It could be that this plant is just like deficient in nutrients, which honestly is kind of helpful to know because if you get crispy tips on your Marantas, I mean, there's lots of reasons for it, but it could also just be like nutrition deficiency, I guess. And as you can see, it's also tried to put out some leaves and they've come out actually like really bright, almost like the variegated version, but much smaller than these really big and gorgeous leaves that I've had in the past. So this has just been in water because I just haven't gotten around to potting it up yet. The roots look fantastic. I mean, look at that. They're beautiful. I love how the roots look on these plants. And this also gives you some insight as to how to propagate these. As you can see, I don't know if you can tell, there are like little knobs, and those are where the nodes are, and the roots will grow from those little knobs. So right over here, I mean, you'll want to cut the plant to where you've got, do you see the little knobby portions? Like here and here. Yeah, you want to find those little knobs. See, even right here, it's like a little crook in the stem. It's a knob. Typically, it'll root from right there. And I've found a lot of success just rooting them in water like that, except don't let them stay in water for as long as I have. The next and final maranta that I have in my collection is another Maranta kerchoveana, but it is the variegated version. So I just call this the variegated Maranta kerchoveana right here. That's so adorable. I love this plant. I did get it just a few months ago. Honestly, I kind of let it go somewhat neglected over the last few months, so I feel like it's already getting pretty leggy. If you've ever seen Wild Fern's variegated Maranta kerchoveana, that is absolute goals for me. So I'm gonna see if I can like grow this out to that point. It'll probably take some like propagating and pruning and lots of love to get it to that level of beauty. The variegation on this one is not like super crazy intense, but you know, there's like little speckles on there and then like a few portions that are more dramatic. But I think that I need to be giving this plant more light, and maybe that'll bring out some of the color. Because I have found, like with pretty much all of these plants, especially Maranta, the amount of light that you give them makes a really big difference in the vibrancy of the markings, as I mentioned before. So my theory is if I give this plant more light, it'll kind of bring out the vibrancy a little bit more. I'm just curious and wondering if giving it more light would help. So yeah, that's definitely something that I'm gonna need to be addressing a lot with this plant, because I want it to just be gorgeous and stunning and have massive leaves that are variegated and perfect. So you know, we'll get there maybe someday, but it's still fairly humble right now. Okay, next we're going to venture into stromanthe, of which I only have one, and it's the stromanthe triostar. Oh, I just dripped water on myself, but that's fine. I watered it today. Wow, this might be like one of my most stunning plants in terms of just how striking the leaves are. Like, look at all of the different colors, and every single leaf is really unique and beautiful. It looks like a painting, honestly. I keep on dripping on myself. This was featured in my favorites video just a few videos back, my August favorites. And I will say, me and this plant have had a tenuous relationship, but now I can confidently say we are in a great spot. Originally, I got this plant and then I got pregnant shortly after that with my son. If you know anything about pregnancy, it's rough, but my pregnancies in particular, both of them, were awful. I had hyperemesis gravidarum, and so I was throwing up constantly and just feeling so sick, so fatigued. A lot of my plants kind of suffered, and the plants that could deal with neglect did fine, but this plant did not appreciate that period of neglect because it also was like busting out of the pot. Like the roots were so thick and getting out of the pot, and so, you know, it would dry out really quickly, so I'd water it, but it dried out, and then it gets stressed out, and so it got spider mites, and also like was fighting root rot, and it was just a huge mess. Eventually I potted it up into this ceramic pot, and it's really liked that, but it was a rocky start, and I really did not think that this plant was going to survive because it felt like it was constantly getting spider mites. And you can see there are some of the leaves remaining that have some spider mite damage, but thankfully this plant is now pest free. And honestly, it was just a journey of being consistent with this plant as the plant kind of acclimated to my environment, and I pampered it a little bit more. Like, look at some of these new leaves, man. They're so beautiful and flawless, and I do have it under very high light now. It's probably getting around 1,000-foot candles for 12 hours a day, so it's getting a lot of light, and it's absolutely loving every minute of it, and it's constantly growing now. It's so happy. But this was like a process that was a year in the making, because for the first 6 months that I owned the plant, it was just not happy. But then we had like a year of rebuilding our relationship and finding rhythms, and now it's finally, I can say, fairly happy. And I don't know, if you want more details on it, you can ask in the comments. I've already talked about this plant a lot in some of my other videos, so I'm just so happy with where it's at. Finally, it is finally the stromanthe triostar of my dreams. Okay, we're down to the last 2 plants. I feel like I have been talking for absolutely ever. But hopefully we can knock these ones out pretty quickly. The next and final genus too is the ctenanthe genus. And honestly, I feel like this is probably the most underrated genus in the Marantaceae family. I don't see people talking about these often enough. But this right here is the ctenanthe setosa. And I will say, this one has had like a little bit of like roughness going on because it's got a lot of like extra floral nectaries. I don't know if you can see that. And I've washed them off periodically, but they keep on coming back. But it also doesn't have any pests that I can see, so I don't know what's up with that. I will say that this is probably pretty prone to that, and like they can harden and get really sticky and weird on the leaves, so that's one thing I don't love about the plant. But for the most part, I mean, if you look at the leaves, like this is like a good example. Look at how beautiful that is. It looks like a feather from a bird. And it's so pretty, and the backs of the leaves again are that gorgeous purple color. And honestly, despite, I mean, the only weird thing about the plant has been the extra floral nectaries that leave like some spots on some of the leaves. But it's not even all of the leaves, it's just some of them sometimes have been a little bit weird. But some of them are flawless and fine. And this isn't a pretty low light situation, so it grows kind of slowly just because of that. But I think that if I had it in a better lighting situation, it would definitely grow quicker. But even so, I mean, it's got like 3 or 4 new leaves coming out right now as we speak. And yeah, it's a very graceful looking plant. I think it's fairly underrated because I don't see a whole lot of people talking about this plant or having it in their collections. But all things considered, I feel like it's pretty easy to grow. It does have some mechanical damage because, I mean, I mentioned they look like feathers, and so my cats will periodically just like jump up and like claw at the leaves because they think it's a toy. So, I mean, I can't blame them. It looks very exciting, but yeah, there's definitely some battle scars on some of these leaves. But even in spite of that, I think that it's just an absolutely beautiful plant that deserves to be in more collections because it's pretty easy to take care of. And then finally, this is my ctenanthe burle-marxii, which is very large and very beautiful. Look at that. Honestly, okay, this is the one that I have in a terracotta pot, and as you can see, there are some leaves that are, I need to trim them away because, you know, that happens periodically. But like for as many leaves as it loses, I mean, this is also the back of the plant that like I don't always get around to rotating the plant. So the front of the plant looks beautiful, but this is the back of the plant that doesn't get as much light. So, you know, it's pretty obvious as to why it's not as happy back there. But yeah, I do need to trim some of these like dead leaves off. But again, that's just kind of part of the normal life cycle because if you look at the rest of the plant, it's very happy for the most part. And there's also just like a lot of new leaves constantly coming in, filling in. I mean, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to show you because they're just kind of hidden in there, but you'll have to take my word for it. There's lots of new growth always happening with this plant. It's very full. And I will say, if you are like a beginner plant parent, you know nothing about plants, and you just want a really big and full and lush and striking plant like this in your collection, or if you want to go for like any sort of plant in the Marantaceae family but you're not really sure which one to pick, this one I highly recommend. I would say it's probably in like my top 3 recommendations because even though it's in a terracotta pot and even though I routinely miss waterings, like, you know, not entirely, but I'll often let this plant get super droopy. Well, not super droopy, but I often let this plant get like fairly droopy, like visibly droopy before I water it, and it always bounces back. And yeah, maybe it has like a few leaves that crisp up or die off here and there, but it's such a full plant that you really don't notice, and new growth comes in to replace it super quickly anyway. So, and if you look at this plant, like there's no crispy tips really to be seen. I mean, there's like one, but for the most part, the vast majority of the leaves look immaculate in my opinion, and I've also never had a pest on this plant. Frankly, this is a super easy plant, and as far as light goes, it's about, let's see, it's about 8 feet away from a south-facing window and 6 or 7 feet away from a west-facing window. So it gets like a decent amount of light, but it's not like direct, bright light. It's maybe more medium light, and it seems to really like that.
I mean, if you're watching this video and you're like, which one should I get that will be more low maintenance and fairly easy to take care of?
In my personal experience, this ctenanthe burle-marxii is severely underrated and so easy. Well, that's that. Those are all of my plants that are in the Marantaceae family. I am aware that a lot of people in the houseplant community have been burned by plants that are in the Marantaceae family, particularly ones that are usually called calatheas. And I understand that. I too have been, you know, on my fair share of roller coasters with a lot of these plants where there will be like a big learning curve or they'll throw temper tantrums, but really my biggest advice is to just give them a chance and tough it out, because once they acclimate to your environment, they're a lot easier to take care of. But you kind of have to like get past those first several months to a year of the plant getting used to your home and used to your care. But once you kind of get in a groove and you get to know the plant and the plant gets to know you, I feel like a lot of these plants honestly would make excellent additions to any houseplant collection. You don't have to get any of these plants if you don't want to, but I personally think that they are just stunning additions. The foliage is unique and just so appealing, honestly. But really, if you are an experienced plant parent, I encourage you to give them another chance. I think that they're worth it. I think that they are worth the effort. You might find that they're not as difficult as you once thought. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. Please leave a comment down below. I'm super curious. Are you an avid collector of plants in the Marantaceae family, or do you have maybe a handful? Like, what has your experience been? Have you tried them before, but then you got burned and you don't want to touch them with a 10-foot pole? Like, what's the vibe? Like, I want to know. So yeah, subscribe if you want to, like this video if you liked it, and I'll see you next time. I hope that you guys have a wonderful and beautiful day. Bye-bye!